The difference between a safe dive and a troubled dive can often come down to a 2-cent piece of elastopolymer. It's quick tips time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Divers Ready. My name's James and we're back once again with yet another quick tips video where I try and cram as much of my scuba diving knowledge into a video, 5 minutes or less. And this week we're talking about O-rings. So subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so already. We're going to head over to the workbench and I'm going to give you the lowdown on this essential component of your dive equipment. Right, let's start with the basics of O-ring technology. How do O-rings actually work? Well, anywhere that you want to make a seal and join two parts, you're going to find an O-ring. And the O-ring's job is actually to apply the pressure of the gas in the scuba system and squeeze itself to fill all the available space between the two faces. Therefore, it's absolutely essential that the O-ring is made out of a flexible material. Now, in the old days, it used to be good old-fashioned rubber. It would be poured into a mold. These days, with polymer technology, we have a lot more choices in the materials that our O-rings are made out of. Typically, these days, you're going to find them made out of some kind of polyethylene or Viton. Viton is a fluorosaturated synthetic rubber. And the advantage of using a Viton O-ring such as this one is that it is completely unreactive to oxygen at the pressures that we're dealing with within scuba, therefore making it safe for use with high oxygen percentage nitrox mixes. I generally prefer to use Viton O-rings in everything, absolutely everything, because they're also mold and fungus resistant, they're resistant to degradation, they last longer. Yes, they're slightly more expensive, but they're just a better quality material. Viton itself is actually a brand name of the DuPont chemical company. O-rings are sized two ways, obviously the diameter of the ring itself and then also the diameter of the cross section, or the thickness if you will. Generally speaking, for scuba diving purposes, O-rings are categorized into either static or dynamic O-rings based on whether they move or not. And that's a pretty accurate description. For example, if you've got a piston in your first stage of your regulator, you're going to have a couple of O-rings around that help guide the O-ring and create the seal while the piston is moving and doing its job to regulate pressure. You'll have other O-rings, like for example in your camera housing or in your lights on the battery caps of your computers, that aren't designed to move. You just screw on the cap and hey presto, you've got a seal. That being said, I generally treat all O-rings as dynamic because technically all O-rings move. Doesn't mean they necessarily slide up and down a chamber like in the first stage, but they all have to compress and expand under pressure to fill the space and provide the seal. Therefore, if you've got O-rings in motion, you're going to want to reduce static, you're going to want to reduce friction, and that's where lubricants come in. There are two very common O-ring lubricants used in scuba diving. The first is silicone, which is cheap, widely available. I use it in all my camera housings, in my lights, in my computer battery door. You just apply a little bit of silicone to the O-ring and just grease it up, and that helps extend the life of the O-ring. The next is called Crystalube. Crystalube is a polytetrafluoroethylene. It's an incredibly expensive, inert synthetic lubricant. Inert meaning that it doesn't react with anything, especially oxygen, and that makes it very useful for applications where it's going to come into oxygen, particularly in high pressures, i.e. oxygen-rich nitrox mixes. So for all my first stages, especially those that I use high pressure oxygen or high percentage oxygen mixes in, you're absolutely going to want to apply Crystalube. If you do an O2 cleaning course, they're going to teach you all about Crystalube, especially how expensive it is. So these are the steps to change out an O-ring in a yoke valve on a cylinder. First, you're going to want to remove the old O-ring. You've got to be careful when you do this not to scratch the groove or put any kind of indentation in the orifice in which the O-ring sits. Otherwise, that O-ring is never going to be able to create the seal and the whole valve is going to be pretty much screwed up. So in order to do that, you want to use a pick that's made of brass, because brass is a soft metal and it's not going to scratch the steel of the O-ring orifice. Then once you've got the old O-ring out, you're going to want to inspect the groove for any kind of debris, clean it if necessary, a little bit of rubbing alcohol to get any kind of grease or nastiness or any sand or silt or anything out of there, and just make sure you've got a nice clean contact surface. And then you're going to reseat a new O-ring in that space. Now some people are going to tell you that you want to like warm the O-ring up in your mouth or wet it or anything like this. No, you don't need to at all. In fact, I don't even use grease on these O-rings. I just push it in with my thumb and make sure that it's nicely seated and squared away. Then I'm going to go on and put my regulator on the cylinder, and before I pressurize it, I'm going to use the yoke orifice on the regulator to make sure that O-ring is well suited, because it's the perfect tool for the job, because it's designed to line up with that O-ring. So once I've put the regulator on, I'm going to take it back off again to make sure that the O-ring is seated correctly before replacing the regulator and then pressure testing it. And the process is pretty much the same for changing out an O-ring on a DIN system, but this time the O-ring sits on the regulator and not on the cylinder. So if you're traveling and using other people's yoke cylinders, I want to make sure that you guys get into the habit of inspecting that yoke O-ring. It's incredibly important. If it's torn, if it looks faded or brittle, or it's in any way flattened, absolutely insist either the dive master on the boat changes that O-ring out for you, or you change it out yourself, because if you've got fizzing going on, if you've got bubbles leaking from between your regulator and the cylinder itself, there's a good chance that you can have water enter your first stage and ruin your regulator. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, everything about the Humble O-ring in a quick tips video, an often overlooked but absolutely essential piece of safety equipment in your scuba configuration. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something from it. If you did, please give it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't done so already. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this was your quick tips video for this week from Divers Ready. My name's James. Dive safe, dive often.